Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm so grateful to Eitan and to everyone at Bar-Ilan who has made this wonderful conference possible, and it's such a wonderful thing to have such a distinguished panel to share this important conversation with. I'm going to make remarks this morning very briefly, but under two headings. First is I want to speak about how I see the world of the new public diplomacy, the world in which we're operating as communicators today, and then I want to talk about the implications of this world for our times. So to begin with, I want to underline the extent to which the world in which we operate as communicators is a different world to the world of 20 years ago. And the first of the great ruptures with the past is the context, the political context. We're now in a world with many different speakers. In the past, the world was divided between two great camps of ideology, the United States, the Soviet Union. Today, the United States retains a special significance in the world, but there are so many more voices out there, there's so much there's so many more voices out there. It's a very different environment to the world of the Cold War. We have more players in the international environment, a new relevance for international organizations. We have a world where non-governmental organizations, even significant individuals, are operating as major voices in the international sphere. I think it's remarkable that a single individual, like Oprah Winfrey, can have a more significant voice in world affairs than about half of the member states of the United Nations, though exactly which half of those member states. I don't want to go on record as saying who I think are less significant than Oprah Winfrey, but you can make your own list. Corporations have a unique voice in world affairs now, and not necessarily speaking the same message as the message of the nation state to which they have been historically connected. And non-state organizations, not only, benign non-state organizations. The United States, after all, is at war with a non-state network, the Al-Qaeda network, and their voice in world affairs has to be taken seriously. There are the new methods of communication that are redefining the world, and I'll spend most of the rest of my time talking about the impact of the internet and the revolution that it's brought to our communications. As I see this, the most significant change is the change in the way in which we understand the relationship between speakers in world affairs. In the past, the voices in world affairs traveled as from the top of some sort of mountain where the great nations would speak and people would listen as if they were seated around the base of some sort of mountain. Today, we don't have that same vertical relationship. As never before, we're speaking, or messages are traveling horizontally. Our messages are traveling across networks, and this is changing everything. I think that we have to get used to a world in which the old divisions between the domestic and the international sphere of communication have been erased, in which words that we speak to our own populations are being heard internationally. But maybe the great problem that this is generating for public diplomacy, as I see it, is that public diplomacy for many countries is becoming a performance for domestic consumption. So there are many countries who say things internationally because they want their domestic populations to hear those, and public diplomacy for many countries, I think particularly the United States, is undermined by domestic political considerations. One of the major changes that is coming out of a networked world, a world where we are connected through the internet, is that there has been a change in the source of credibility. Today, as never before, credibility comes, and we know this from a lot of public opinion research, all points to the same thing. You ask people, who is the most credible person for you on any subject? And what people say is, it's someone like me. This flows from the observation made famous by Time magazine when they put a mirror on the cover as Person of the Year to say the internet makes you the driving force. The point is that through the internet we all have an opinion, and we're able to connect to other people who have the same opinion or the same background as us. This is a great challenge if your main communication problem is to communicate with people who are on the surface not like you at all. How do you break into their world? How do you find a credible voice for this audience? And this is something I hope we can address in questions. There's a new vocabulary in this world, a vocabulary of branding. Some nations have paid great attention to their international brand, and we've got a whole session on this tomorrow afternoon. But one thing that I find very challenging and in this world of the new public diplomacy is the emergence of a new international morality. And this might be the most controversial thing that I'm talking about, actually. That if we were talking 500 years ago about how to be a credible communicator in the world, we would say, well, if you're talking within Europe, then you have to cover yourself in a mantle of the Christian religion, because that is the ethical foundation of the people that you are speaking to. If we'd have been talking in the 19th century, we would have to say, cover your nation in the ideal of civilization that is shared between the great powers. In the 20th century, it was about human rights, democracy, and these values that were shared. But today, increasingly, there's a new international morality that is based around sustainability. I could see this emerging as early as the first Gulf War, when a lot of people in Western Europe, what really got them upset about Saddam Hussein was not his treatment of Kurdish people, but the condition of the cormorants in the Gulf after the oil spill. And you know that there's something changing today when Osama bin Laden is attacking the United States, not for its support of Israel or its presence in Islamic lands, but because of its contribution to global warming. This is an international morality, and countries are being judged around the world according to a new standard. This offers both opportunities, but it also identifies new, new forms of weakness and new vulnerabilities that haven't been there before. As we think about this world, we have a new theory, the theory of soft power, which is becoming an orthodoxy. It's common to accept that a nation will be judged by its values. But you have to make sure that the values you're talking about, the values that you're being judged by, will not necessarily be the values that your population share. And this is a particular problem for Israel, a country which is based around a particular set of ethics and a faith that is outside of Israel, a minority. But the bottom line, the real problem and the real extension of soft power is it recognizes the extent to which in the world today hard power does not work. Hard power backfires. To deploy hard power is to enhance the soft power of one's enemy, because there is nothing as persuasive in the world today as victimhood. And every time you strike your enemy, you build up their narrative of suffering and give them enhanced credibility. And this is a real problem. And in my in my work, when speaking to audiences, I routinely point to the Gaza War of 2006 as a prime example of this, how by all of the old rules of power, Israel won, and yet we know from the soft power point of view, Israel lost that conflict and lost big time. So what are the implications of this new world of public diplomacy? Well, the first implication is that public diplomacy matters. And yet we know it matters. We know that communication has moved from the periphery of international relations, from some sort of luxury that some diplomats could pursue, to a centrality. It has a centrality, and yet we spend so little money on it. We devote so little time to making sure that it's done well, so little energy to coordinating it. And this conference is part of a move to change that and to move public diplomacy to the position on the agenda that it deserves, which is right at the top of the agenda. Secondly, when we approach public diplomacy as any form of communication, the most important step is to listen. Not to your own people, but to listen to the people you wish to communicate with. Because it's insanity to attempt to communicate before you have learnt anything or understood who you're communicating to. And the more you know about your audience, and the more you're able to segment your audience, the better you will be as a communicator. We listen first and then we speak. Third, as we approach public diplomacy, we have to understand that time matters. Public diplomacy takes time to work, and success will be long-term. Public diplomacy cannot be judged in a single political cycle. The benefits of public diplomacy are felt over a long period, and the powers that have, the countries, the actors that have succeeded in their public diplomacy are countries who have had a long-term strategy and have built relationships over a sustained period. Fourth, individuals matter. Public diplomacy is about relationships, and it functions best when you take the time to construct relationships with people in other countries, sometimes with gatekeepers or people who will be able to speak on your behalf to wider populations, sometimes with individuals, sometimes with people who are just citizens. But it's about relationships, and relationships means two-way, not just you talking to them, them talking to you responding to what they say, and maybe incorporating what they say into your way of doing things. Fifth, stories matter. If you think about the world as an interconnected network, then the information that passes across that network most effectively is a story. It's like a little creature that can live on the network, like a spider that can run out across the network, reproduce, and a good story will keep reproducing, going to more and more people. But equally, so will a bad story. So will a story from your enemy that is attractive. It can spread and spread and spread, and you know how that works because you've experienced that. The stories are vehicles for ideas. So a good communicator has to refine their stories, has to empower the positive stories, make sure the stories are told, but also understand that you will not be the final person to tell the story. You have to introduce your stories on the assumption that somebody else will be repeating it, someone else will pass it along. So don't expect to be the end user, the final speaker on any subject. Assume that what you do will be passed on. Number 6, information matters. If you do not speak, if you do not facilitate the understanding of others, someone else will fill that void for you. And I'm not here just talking about the way in which, say, the IDF didn't bring journalists into Jenin during the Jenin incursion, and therefore the whole Jenin massacre story could take hold because that story was told entirely from the Palestinian point of view to begin with. I'm talking about how if Israel isn't speaking, if Israel isn't explaining, sometimes your friends will do the speaking for you. And the people who are friendly in the United States, for example, are not necessarily your friends. There is only one frame that will suit the needs of Israel, and that's the frame that is put on by the people of Israel. Otherwise, you are serving someone else's agenda. And it may be just the agenda of a journalist who wants to be more famous, or a news channel that wants people to watch their news and so is sensationalizing it. It will not be the frame that serves the needs of you. So as communicators, you have to get the information out first because no one else will do it as well. I believe that dissent matters, that you have to make sure that a variety of voices from your country is being heard overseas, that it is, so you should be proud of your diversity and the differences between your citizens. Now in Israel this is not a problem, because on any subject there are many, many opinions. But I feel it's very important that those opinions be made known in the United States particularly, but elsewhere in the world. It's a great strength of Israel, and to have this diversity of opinion. And diversity is attractive. I think that is a great element in Israel's soft power. Number 8, mutuality matters. By this I mean you have to understand public diplomacy is a two-way process. No one should go into public diplomacy only looking to speak. You wouldn't give much time to a person who went into a bar room or a party and expected to be the only one speaking and was not open to any interaction or learning or self-transformation from an encounter. We know people like that and we avoid them. It's the same is true at an international level. You go in open to transformation, open to learning, without necessarily an end point. My 9th observation is that brands matter. And brands here I'm using as a shorthand for the reputation, and the reputation that exists in the mind of the audience. But we may establish a brand and put a lot of energy into telling people who we are, but then we have to stand behind that brand. And for me, the great implication of thinking in terms of a brand is to understand that that means you have to manage yourself and manage your own people as much as you are telling people who you are. You have to make sure you conform to that brand. So if you have a brand based on law, as the United States has, a brand based on law which everyone knows, you cannot then break those laws. If you have a brand based on decency, as the United States does, you cannot then torture people, send people off to secret camps in Eastern Europe for interrogation. The Russians can do that. Nobody minds if the Russians torture people, because Russia has a brand that incorporates that kind of behavior. For the United States, it's not something that can be done. My final point, and this is something that I want to explore in discussion, is that relevance matters. And if you only take one concept away from this conversation, I hope it will be that nations are judged around the world in very, very selfish terms. People ask the question, what can country X do for me? And they base their opinion on that country based on what it's doing for them. Why are people friendly towards Sweden? Because Sweden sells great furniture cheaply, right, at IKEA, and pretty good cars, and is contributing to global citizenship around the world. Now, Israel does a lot for people around the world, but your problem is that the number one thing you do is give people something to dislike, something to define themselves against, something to sit around, if you're in the dinner party set in the UK, saying, oh, look what they're doing now. Aren't we, wonderful intellectuals for being angry about this? You are providing a service to the world of being the bad guy. And that is not in your interest, but it's going to be very hard to provide something that will be as attractive, as valuable to the world as the service you're doing by being a pariah. And think about the meaning of Israel for the Arabs, for your enemies. If there wasn't Israel, what would they be? You're the one thing that these countries can agree about. Apart from, now they can dislike the United States too, but the starting point is feeling about Israel. So as you think about Israeli public diplomacy, it's important to think about, well, what can Israel do? What can Israel be that is of relevance to your audience, and that disrupts these other narratives. So that, and I've seen, I was in Shanghai at the Shanghai Expo, and Israel did a great job of talking to the people of China and making it absolutely clear to China what Israel was. It was not the country of Moses, it was not the country of Ben-Gurion, it was the country of Einstein. And China needs to know the country of Einstein because China wants to be involved in new technology, high technology, and the relevance of Israel to China was completely clear. And it was, I thought, a very, very appropriate, very successful display. But finding those areas where Israel can be of relevance and positive to audiences, for me, that's the way to go. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to further discussion. Thank you for having me.